Hello everyone, my name is André Gagné. I want to welcome you to my YouTube channel. This week I will be continuing the series that I've started a couple of weeks ago entitled Pillars of Neo-Fundamentalism. So on the first week we looked at the first pillar, which was biblical inerrancy. The second week we talked about interpretive certainty. And last week we looked at the issue of spiritual warfare, the third pillar, which is the battle of two kingdoms. Now, this week, again, we will look at a fourth pillar. There's 5 in all. All of this, just to remind you, is based on some of the ideas that come from this book from Colonel V. Donor. The book entitled Christian Jihad, Neo-Fundamentalism, and the Polarization of America. So in his book, he talks about 5 important pillars that Neo-Fundamentalists adhere to, and in which they build their entire belief system. So I've been looking at some of these pillars. In fact, we'll be looking at the 5 pillars, but I've been kind of adding some elements to complement the things that he says in this very, very insightful and important book. So if you don't have the book, I strongly recommend that you actually buy the book. It's not that expensive and very accessible and very easy to read. So like I was saying, this week we will be focusing on this fourth pillar, which is the issue that revolves around covenantal theology. Covenantal theology. So what is that exactly? It's the belief or the idea that Christians are in a covenant relationship with God. So because they have established, or at least God has established this covenant, this alliance with them, they have certain responsibilities. God has certain responsibilities towards them, and they do have certain responsibilities towards God. And one of the things is, if they believe and obey God's laws and God's will, they will be blessed. But if they disobey, there are consequences to this disobedience. There are consequences, there are results, there are even what I can call curses. So they will not be blessed in any shape or form. They will suffer if they do not meet God's requirements, and if they do not obey in his laws. So it's essentially what some Christians, at least some neo-fundamentalists, believe that the covenants that were given to Israel have now been transferred, or are in a certain sense still in effect for Christians. So a lot of neo-fundamentalists do believe that a lot of the laws of the Hebrew Bible, for example, or the Old Testament, are still applicable, and they still have a responsibility to fulfill those laws. There are a particular branch of neo-fundamentalists called Christian Reconstructionists that do in fact defend this idea that they are in a covenantal relationship, or Christians are in a covenantal relationship with God, and they have the responsibility to obey God if they want to be blessed, and and avoid any kind of judgment on Christians in general if they disobey the laws of God. So we can ask ourselves, where do these ideas come from? Of course, they do come from the Bible, but I would like to take a few minutes to kind of unpack these ideas by looking at the writings of some of these neo-fundamentalists. Maybe one book in particular, because these videos are not an hour long and they're already over 20 minutes, and I know that for some 20 minutes it's a lot of time because you don't have a lot of time, but I do appreciate the time that you take to actually listen to these little clips. So I want to look at one book, one particular book. You see the title on the screen. It's called Christian Reconstruction, What It Is and What It Isn't. It was written in 1991 by Gary North, a very, very important player in the Christian Reconstruction movement, and Gary DeMar. Like I said, published in 1991. You can see on your screen also there's the table of content. They cover a lot of ground, as you can see. So there's two parts to this. One is God's covenantal kingdom, and all the chapters there are written by were written by Gary North. And there's a second part that was written by DeMar, questions frequently asked about Christian Reconstruction. And the ending, why are Christian Reconstructionists confrontational? And that last portion is was written by both authors. But what I want to do is look at the definitions that they give and the reasons why they give, why they believe in this idea that Christians are under this covenantal relationship. And if they do, in a sense, respect the covenant that that they're engaged in with God, they will be blessed. But if they don't, judgment is inevitable. So one passage from his book, if you can see it now on your screen on page 52, North is going to talk about a new opportunity. And I want to read two paragraphs here that kind of contextualize where this idea comes from, because they're not the first ones to actually talk about this. So he says Christians today have a golden opportunity, an opportunity that doesn't come even as often as once in a lifetime. It comes about once every 250 years. The last time it came for Christians was during the American Revolution era, 1776 to 1789. The revolutionary humanists who created and ran the French Revolution from 1789 to 1795 created a satanic alternative, one which is with us still in the demonic empire of communism. But that empire has now begun to crumble visibly. A showdown is coming in time and on earth. Christ versus Satan, Christianity versus humanism, the dominion religion versus the power religion. You are being called by God to take up a position of judicial responsibility on the side of Christ. One aspect of this responsibility is to render biblical political judgments. So this is charged with a lot of things. Just this little paragraph, it really unpacks a lot of their ideas. This idea that the covenantal theology, first of all, he's going to develop that a little later, but he tries to contextualize this. And he says that the days, this was written, of course, at the end of the 20th century, 1991, now is a golden opportunity. People have to take that responsibility, and Christians need to realize that they have to take a position for Christ. And they have a responsibility, essentially, to execute biblical political judgment. So do you see here, what's important is that for the author, Christians should be involved politically. And this is part of their mandate. This is what stems out from dominionism. They have a mandate to rule the world, rule the earth, and establish God's kingdom. So you have, in a nutshell, this call to dominionism, this call to arms, this call to position oneself as a Christian against secular humanism. As you notice, Gary North and a lot of Neo-Fundamentalists, and we see this even on certain Twitter feeds, they have an allergic reaction to anything that's communist. And they have an allergic reaction often to any form of socialism that they do kind of associate to communism. But be that as it may, this kind of lays a bit the foundation of this dominionism, this dominion theology. And of course, they see themselves as responsible for what's going to happen in the world. Because they have a responsibility as Christians, they need to be the light of the world. They need to be the salt of the earth. So that's going to finally, by their actions, they can finally, in a sense, prevent the judgment of God. Prevent, for example, the judgment of God on American society. Prevent the judgment of God on Canada. Especially when these groups of Christians believe that their nation was, first of all, founded on Judeo-Christian values, which is, of course, a problem, which is a myth, because the founding fathers did not necessarily have this in mind. But be that as it may, they do believe that. And because they believe that the nation, either America, Canada, whatever nation that has these Judeo-Christian foundations, need to return to God. This nation needs to return to God, to repent. And if it does, God will heal the nation. God will bless the nation. I remember in my years as a Neo-Fundamentalist myself, I was in a Pentecostal church on the South Shore of Montreal. And I remember in our church, there was something very striking. When you entered, there was a gigantic map of the province of Quebec. And the map, inside the map, there was a particular verse taken from the book of Chronicles. You see this verse on the screen. It's in Chronicles chapter 2, verse 7, chapter 2 Chronicles, chapter 7, verse 14. It says, "If my people who are called by my name humble themselves, pray, seek my face, and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and heal their land." So you see, it's basically this belief that if people turn away from their sins, God will bless them. But it's in the context of 2 Chronicles, it's Israel, it's the Judaic nation, the Jewish nation at that time. So the people that are called upon my name, or the people whom are called by my name. So those people are essentially the Jews in the context of 2 Chronicles. But Neo-Fundamentalists apply this to them, or to the current situation. So if any nation that has as a foundation a Judeo-Christian values, if they turned away from that, they need to repent if they want to see God bless their nation. So it was the same for Quebec, in a sense. At that time, the pastors believed that if Quebecers turned their hearts towards God, God would heal the Quebec province. And it's the same thing. You hear this constantly. This verse is often quoted by Neo-Fundamentalists as a way to call Christians and call their entire nations back to God. So if we continue reading, just to go back to North's work, if you continue reading some of this stuff that he writes, on page 53, there is an elaborate section. You can see it on your screen. There's a section called the Covenant Structure. And there he explains what the covenant is in a certain sense. And he's going to talk about the Puritans. He's going to talk about the Calvinists, who were among the first to actually talk about those things. So we can read that long section. It reads as follows. To get the correct answers, we need to first ask the right questions. For a long, long time, Christians and Jews have had the right questions right under their noses, but no one paid attention. The questions concerning lawful government are organized in the Bible around a single theme, the covenant. Most Christians and Jews have heard the biblical word covenant. They regard themselves and occasionally even each other as covenant people. They are taught from their youth about God's covenant with Israel and how this covenant extends or doesn't to the Christian church. Yet hardly anyone can define the word. If you go to a Christian or a Jew and ask him to outline the basic features of the biblical covenant, he will not be able to do it rapidly or perhaps even believably. Ask two Jews or two Christians to explain the covenant and compare their answers. The answers will not fit very well. For over 4 centuries, Calvinists have talked about the covenant. They are known as Covenant Theologians. The Puritans wrote seemingly endless numbers of books about it. The problem is nobody until 1985 had ever been able to come up with the covenant model in the writings of Calvin, nor in the writings of all his followers. The Calvinists had always hung their theological hats on the covenant, yet they had never put down on paper precisely what it is, what it involves, and how it works in the Bible or in church history. Later, he's going to talk about Ray Sutton as the one who studied in 1985, who studied the covenants and came across this structure of all covenants and how this applies also to the church. But you see in the context here, he's going to talk about the covenant. He's going to talk about how Calvinists were covenant theologians, Puritans embraced the idea of covenant. And later in the book, he's going to say that Christians need to rediscover this reality for themselves. They need to rediscover the idea that God has entered into a covenant with Christians, and they have a responsibility to follow and respect that covenant if they want God to bless them. If they don't, judgment will knock at the door. Judgment upon Christians, but judgment on the nation where Christians live. So Christians are ultimately responsible for the outcome of God's blessing and judgment, in a sense. It's very God doesn't seem to be very autonomous in this context. In the context of covenants, it's just like an entente. So if you meet one part of the bargain, your part of the bargain, God's going to meet his part of the bargain. So he continues. It's interesting. On page 56, you see it on your screen. He's going to talk in chapter 6 about four covenants, the four covenants of God. First of all, he's going to describe what a covenant is. So in the on the opening page of chapter 6, he's going to describe this by asking the question, what is a covenant? God comes before man and lays down the law, his law. Man must either conform to God by obeying his law or else be destroyed. As he told Adam, eat of the tree of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and you will die. God deals with men as a king deals with his subjects. His covenant is to prosper us when we obey and curse us when we rebel. First, God makes a personal covenant with man. A man's eternal destiny depends on how he responds to God's covenant. God also makes institutional covenants with men. There are three of these: family, church, and state. Each has an appropriate oath. Each has laws. Each has penalties for disobedience. So as you can see, the covenants are based on laws. God has a law, and God deals with his people like a king deals with his subjects. So they have responsibilities, and God's going to meet his responsibilities. So, of course, when they read the Bible then, and they come to texts like Deuteronomy chapters 29 and 30 that talks about blessings and curses, they take that for themselves. You see, this is not something in their minds that was applicable to the nation of Israel at the time of the writing of the book of Deuteronomy. This is still applicable in general terms for Neo-Fundamentalists, for Christians and nations that say that they are under God, or that have had at the beginning their origins, their foundation in Judeo-Christian values. So it's not surprising. Look, for example, there's a passage on your screen in Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 15 to 19. So we're not really surprised when we read a text like this one, that covenantal theologians, in a sense, would embrace this idea, would actually believe this, even if at the origins this was for the nation of Israel. See, I have set before you today life and prosperity, death and adversity. If you obey the commandments of the Lord your God that I am commanding you today, by loving the Lord your God, walking in his ways and observing his commandments, decrees, and ordinances, then you shall live and become numerous, and the Lord your God will bless you in the land that you are entering to possess. But if your heart turns away and you do not hear, but are led astray to bow down to other gods and serve them, I declare to you today that you shall perish. I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Choose life so that you and your descendants may live. So this is pretty straightforward for the Israelites. They were entering the promised land. God made a covenant with them that they should obey only his laws and follow him only, and not give themselves over to idolatry and to the laws of other gods or worship other gods. If they obeyed God, God would bless them, and he would provide financially, and he would make them prosper. There's a long list. If you read chapters 29 and 30, we won't have time today, but if you read those chapters, you'll see there's a long list of types of blessings that come upon a nation, or at least Israel, that believes, and curses if they disbelieve, or if they do not follow God's laws. So you see, it's very conditional upon believing and obeying. Now, this applies to Israel, you see, but Neo-Fundamentalists think that this applies essentially to them. And Ray Sutton, when he studied the covenants, he came out establishing a kind of structure for each of the covenants that he found in the Bible. And he said this structure still applies today. So you see why they are so concerned with the state of societies today, why they are against abortion, why they are against same-sex marriage, because in the Bible these things are essentially not permitted. They are condemned. They are condemned as sin. And if these people turn away from God's laws by engaging in what constitutes for Neo-Fundamentalists sin, God will bring about judgment. So this is why they're fighting to have biblical values as the framework of American society, or any kind of society in which Neo-Fundamentalists find themselves in, because they want to resist against sin, and they want to prevent God's judgment to fall upon a nation. So if we go back to North is going to list the structure of each covenant. So you see it on your screen here on page 57 of his book. At the top here, he mentions this structure. It's a fivefold structure. Each covenant has this. First, an announcement that God is transcendent, the supreme creator and deliverer of mankind. God is completely superior to and different from men and the world he created, yet he is also present in it, so he is immanent. 2, the establishment of a hierarchy to enforce God's authority on earth. 3, a set of ethical rules or laws man must follow in exercising his dominion over the earth. God will judge man on how well he follows these laws. 4th, a list of judgments that will be imposed by God, who blesses man for obedience and curses man for disobedience. 5, a program of inheritance, a lawful transition that mortal men need in order to extend their dominion over creation. So essentially, all these elements are found according to Sutton, in every single covenant that you read in the Bible. And this applies to Christians today. Even if it's in the Hebrew Bible, even if it's in the Old Testament and it's Old Testament law, this does not change for many Neo-Fundamentalists. Okay? So it is not about just following principles that you have in the New Testament, but it's about following the moral code that is clearly set out in the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible. Clearly following, for example, the Ten Commandments. Why are Neo-Fundamentalists fighting so much for the establishment of the Ten Commandments? That the Ten Commandments should be the basis of any Judeo-Christian society. It's because, they believe in a covenant. They believe that they are in a covenantal relationship with God, and they have this responsibility to follow God's laws, or else they will be under judgment, and the nation will itself be judged. So, you see, essentially, they're caught. They're caught in this situation of either or. If you do this, you'll be blessed. If not, you'll be cursed. I want to read a last section in North's chapter, this chapter 6, which kind of elaborates on the importance of the covenant and how that is tied into the idea of dominion and built into what is called dominionism. So you see it on your screen. It's also on page 57. It's a long passage, but it's worth it. And we're going to end with this. We examine the laws of God and we'll evaluate how well we are following them personally and with our own families. Then we compare the requirements of God's laws with institutions in our own nation, church, state, and family. If we find that society is disobeying God's covenantal principles, then we can conclude that judgment is coming. The curses of God will fall on those who rebel against him. These 5 points are inescapable concepts. You can't avoid them. We never face the question of covenant or no covenant. We face the question, whose covenant? It is a choice between God's covenant or man's covenant, a covenant with the Creator or a covenant with Satan. There are no other choices available. There is no covenantal neutrality. Christians are called by God to exercise dominion in every area of life. God has transferred the ownership of the world to Christians, just as he transferred it to Adam before Adam rebelled. We are now called to take possession of the world in terms of God's covenantal principles and by means of God's sovereign grace. So you can't be clearer than that. For Christian Reconstructionists, for many Neo-Fundamentalists, they are called to retake possession of God's world, because Adam lost it when he rebelled. And you see, there's no neutrality. You're either on God's side or on Satan's side. You're either on the side of God's law or on the side of secularism, which is against God in their view. There's no neutrality. Someone is going to be under a covenant somehow, but whose covenant? Is it God's or is it Satan's? And you see how they're saying you need to evaluate. This is why Christians are always evaluating what's going on in society. A lot of Neo-Fundamentalists and opposing what's going on in society, especially when it doesn't fit their biblical worldview, because this is what they're supposed to do. You look at society, you look at what's going on in the church, you look at what's going on in the state's decisions on certain issues and certain policies. You look at how the family is treated by the state. And you judge according to what you know in the Bible, and if it fits the biblical worldview. And if it doesn't, then you can expect, unless people repent, you can expect God's judgment. So you see, this is the fourth pillar. This explains a lot why they act the way they act. This explains a lot why they're confrontational on so many issues that don't fit their worldview. This explains a lot why they're calling for nations to repent, to turn away from their sins so that they can be blessed. Because they know that nations, in their estimation, are under God's judgment if they don't follow God's laws. So this is what I wanted to talk to you about this week. This was the fourth pillar. Next week we will be talking about the fifth pillar. Thank you so much for taking this time to watch these short clips. If you do enjoy them, please subscribe. You can also like, and you can also share those videos. And I will see you again next week for another short clip on the pillars of Neo-Fundamentalism. Thank you very much, and have a great week.